Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. We're going to have a kitchen day today. We're going to be making lots of bone broth. Now, probably a week or two ago, I posted a video. It was my Azure Standard haul, and I got a big box, 40 pounds of frozen chicken bones, basically, chicken frames, they called it. And I shared that my plan was to make a big batch of chicken bone broth with that. I'm planning to get out my pressure canner and can all of this broth once I make it. Now, I will say, first of all, this is not the entirety of the bones that were included in that 40-pound box. Several of you, when I posted that Azure haul, have requested that I make a video of making this broth. I just want to say up front that this will be a video of me making the bone broth. I'm not going to make a video of the canning part of the process because I'm fairly new to pressure canning, and I'm sure there are lots of great resources out there that will be able to help you with pressure canning more than I can. But I did want to share with you the process of turning all these chicken bones into delicious bone broth. Now, I do want to say the bulk of the broth I'll be making in my roaster oven here. This is going to be the largest batch of bone broth that I have made. Normally when I make bone broth, I use a single chicken carcass or just a couple chicken frames that we basically were left over from having roasted chicken or roasted turkey after Thanksgiving, something like that. So I have not made bone broth on this large of a scale before, so this will be an adventure that we will go on together. So as I said, this is not all of the bones that were in the package. This is what we're going to be starting with. As you can see, I'm in the process of preheating my oven. As I mentioned, usually when I've made bone broth in the past, I have made it using the leftover bones from a chicken or a turkey that we've roasted. So the bones are already roasted. These bones are raw and not roasted, so the first step I'm going to do before turning these into broth is I'm going to roast them in my oven. So it's preheating to 425 right now. I'm going to roast these for guidelines that I've seen online say between 30 to 60 minutes or until they have a nice deep color. So the purpose of roasting these bones before making the broth is supposed to just really increase the depth of flavor. So I'm going to be roasting these in multiple batches. This is my first batch, which is about to go in the oven. And then you can see that this one actually has a little bit of ice crystal on it still. This isn't even fully defrosted yet. So this is gonna roast for 30 to 60 minutes, and then I'll stick this in my fridge while this is roasting, and then we'll pop that in next. So my biggest challenge so far, and what I think will probably be the biggest challenge in this whole process, is defrosting the bones. They came in a really large 40-pound box, and that can be challenging to defrost. I'm also not going to be using all of the bones today. So I think what I'm going to do, how I ended up defrosting them, first of all, was they come in a really thick plastic bag. And just to make sure that that plastic bag was extra safe, I stuck the whole thing into a trash bag so it was double layered. And I put it in my bathtub and filled it up with water to defrost it a little more quickly. Now, probably the safest way to defrost a large thing like this would be to clear out your refrigerator and defrost it in there. Because I wanted to defrost it more quickly, as I said, I used the cool water in the bathtub method. And then as the frames have been defrosting, I've been coming and pulling the frames off the edge. So you can see these are the defrosted ones. These will be sitting in my fridge, finishing defrosting while these roast. Now, I'm not going to be making the entire batch today, which makes it, that's another layer of challenge here because that's a lot of bones. I only have this one roaster oven, and I think I will be making a little bit of broth also on my stovetop and also in my crock pot. So we'll have lots of different broth batches in process, but that's not going to give me enough broth for all the bones. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to roast all of the bones today, even though I won't be making all of the broth, and then I will refreeze all of the bones, the roasted bones that I won't be using today. That way when I go to make the rest of the broth, it makes the process a little bit easier. So let's get this first batch in the oven. We'll get those in the fridge, and I'll meet you back here when these are done roasting, and we will get them in the roaster oven and start making some broth. And here is how the bones look after about 45 minutes in the oven. So I left these in for 45 minutes. I checked on them after 30 minutes and they didn't seem quite done. There is quite a bit of meat still on these bones, which I think might have been part of the reason why it took a little bit longer. Also, they were still pretty cold from having just been defrosted. But this looks like a good level of color to me. So I'm gonna go ahead and start adding these chicken frames into my roaster oven. I don't have this roaster oven preheated. This is just at room temperature. Just gonna go ahead and get these in here, and then I'm gonna add a little bit of apple cider vinegar to the pan. So as you can see, there's quite a bit of liquid in this pan here. I'm gonna go ahead and pour all this right into the roaster oven too. There's lots of goodness in there, and we wanna make sure we get that. We also want to make sure that we add some acidity to these bones, because that's going to really, it's going to change the pH of the liquid and allow for a lot of the goodness that's in the bones to really get pulled out. So you can see this pan here has lots of little bits from the chicken. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to add some apple cider vinegar to this, kind of scrape it up, and then we will add this vinegar and chicken bit mixture into our pan of bones. So I don't usually measure this, but we'll try to add maybe a 1/4 cup or so. Should be about right. So I'm just going to go ahead and get these other chicken bones into this pan here. We'll get these roasting. And then once that's in the oven and working, then we will proceed with our batch of broth over here. So over here, we have all of our roasted chicken bones, and we have apple cider vinegar. Now at this point, you could just cover this with water. You could just call it good and make your broth at that point. I like to add some additional components for flavor. As I said, that's entirely optional. It kind of depends on what your use for the bone broth is. You could also just keep it pretty simple, and then you could flavor it when you're actually going to cook with it. I like to have it somewhat flavored already, so I'm going to add a little bit more flavor components. I'm going to add a few more flavor components to this. So I have here some sage and some thyme from the garden. We're going to go ahead and add some of this in. I'll keep some of this. As I mentioned, I am going to be making more broth in a pan on my stove and also in my crock pot, so I will save some of the herbs for that. But we'll add a little bit in here. I also like to stick in a couple bay leaves. And we will also add some peppercorns. Now I'm not going to add any salt to this. That's probably a good amount of peppercorns there. As I said, this part is all basically personal preference. I'm not going to add any salt to this because I like to keep it pretty low sodium, and then that's something when I'm actually cooking with it, I like to be able to control the amount of salt that's going into whatever I'm making. So when I'm cooking with it, I will salt it at that point, but for now we're just going to keep it salt-free. So one more thing. I'm going to get my broth bags out of the freezer and dump those in here too. I'll show you that in a second. So since I knew I was planning to make a big batch of broth soon, for the last few weeks I've been saving a lot of my veggie scraps that I've been cooking with. So I like to save scraps from things that go really well in like a classic chicken soup. So we've got onion skins and onion ends here. I've got carrot peels, I've got celery ends, I've got little stalks of parsley. A lot of those kind of flavors go really well in broth. So I've been saving the scraps of these, and that way I can get some delicious extra flavor, some delicious onion flavor, some extra herb flavor, without actually having to use fresh vegetables. These are basically scraps that would have just gone in the compost otherwise. This way I get to use them. So I'm just going to go ahead and add some of these into my pan here. And we'll add this one as well. So most of this is completely optional. As I said, I just like to add it because I like that extra flavor. So at this point, the only thing left to add is water. So I'm just going to add enough water to fully cover and submerge all of my ingredients in here, which is probably going to be a couple gallons. So I'll show you what that looks like once we've got it added. So this looks pretty good to me. This is pretty full, but not close to overflowing, so I don't have to worry about it splashing out. And all of my ingredients are mostly submerged. A lot of my vegetable peels will just kind of submerge themselves as they cook. So this is about 3 gallons of water that we added here, and I think that's the perfect amount. So this is ready. what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this sit for about 45 minutes to an hour, just as it is, without turning on the heat. And that's going to allow that apple cider vinegar to really get started pulling the nutrients out of the bones. Once it's been sitting for about an hour or so, I'm going to go and turn my roaster oven on to about 200 degrees. We want this to be just below a boil. We don't want it to actually be boiling, but we want it to be warm enough that it's really going to be, obviously we want it warm enough that we're going to be preventing bacterial growth. We also want it hot enough that it's going to be pulling nutrients out and really infusing that water with all this delicious flavor. So once that happens, once we have it at the right temperature, just below a boil, we're going to let this go for 24 hours. You can let it go a little bit longer if you want to. I'll take a look at it after 24 hours and see how I feel about it, if I think it should go a little longer or if it's good how it is. I will meet you back here again at that point and show you how it looks at that point. Now, with the bones that are in the oven now, those are going to get split between a large stock pot on my stove and between my crock pot. And those I'm going to basically just do exactly the same process that I'm doing here. We'll add these extra aromatics for flavor. We'll add the apple cider vinegar, and then we'll cover it all with water and we'll let it simmer at a really low temperature for about 24 hours as well. So that's my plan. As I said, I will meet you back here if there's any interesting updates to share along the way. If not, I'll meet you back here after 24 hours and I'll show you what all this broth looks like at that point. Well, friends, it's the next day. Our chicken broth has been cooking for a little over 24 hours. I think it's been about 27, 28 hours, something like that. And it's looking really good. I'll show you what it looks like. So you can see everything is really broken down. Everything's been cooking really well, infusing this water with lots of flavor. Now, if you remember, when we first got this broth set up, we added lots of flavoring to it, but we did not add any salt. I've been testing it over the last day, slightly over a day as it cooks, and I determined that it did need a little bit of salt. I think actually, I don't usually salt my broth when I'm cooking it. I usually keep it unsalted, and what I do is end up salting it when I use it to cook with later. I think the difference is that, as I mentioned before, I usually use bones from a chicken or a turkey that we've previously roasted, and of course that has been seasoned and lots of the seasoned drippings, mix in. So this definitely needed a little bit of salt because we started with raw chicken. Of course, we roasted it and roasted the bones, which does give it extra flavor, but it did need a little bit of salt. So that being said, I added some salt to this. I did not make it, if I was going to drink this straight, I would want to still add more salt to it. But because I don't know exactly what I'm going to be using this to cook with, I'm not sure what other ingredients I'll be adding into these dishes that this broth is going to go in, I only added a little bit of salt. So, that's personal preference. Do with that what you will. So I'm going to go ahead and taste this broth again, and we'll see if it's done. Definitely very hot. That's really good. That is much better since I added the salt. As I said, when I actually cook with this, I will most likely add more salt depending on exactly what I'm making. But I'm going to say that this broth is done cooking. Now, as I said, I am going to be pressure canning this broth. If you want to preserve it, you don't necessarily need to do that. It'll store in the fridge for a few days perfectly fine. You can also package it up and freeze it. I am pretty limited on freezer space, which is why I want to can this and make it shelf stable. So I am going to be using my pressure canner. As I said, because that's something that I'm fairly new with, I don't feel comfortable giving a tutorial for pressure canning. There are lots of great options out there. But I'm just going to go ahead and prepare this broth for canning. I'll jar it up, I'll can it. I'll meet you back here when I'm done canning so we can see exactly what we got. So it's once again the next day. I finished canning this last night, so I pulled everything out of the canners and I just wanted to show you what we got. So I've got 9 quarts of bone broth here. I actually made 10. I have one in my refrigerator that I didn't can because we're going to use that for cooking in the next couple days. And we got 19 pints of chicken bone broth. I decided to can this in a mix of quarts and pints because, you know, sometimes when you're cooking you need different amounts. So if we're making something like a big batch of soup, a lot of times we'll use the quart. But you know, sometimes you just need a cup or two depending on what you're making, and having it canned in pints just gives me a little more versatility. So I hope this was helpful for you. If you have any tips for making chicken bone broth or just making any kind of broth, go ahead and leave them in the comments because I would love to hear them. So thank you for hanging out with me in my kitchen over the last few days as we tackled this big project of making and canning all this chicken bone broth. I hope you're all having a great day. I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.